My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Having officiated many weddings, I've assisted couples in preparing their vows. Most couples desire personalized vows that address their unique love and relationships. Occasionally, couples ask for more traditional vows in the call and response manner, ending with the line, "Until death do us part." That fatalistic phrase raises a profound question. Is death the end of life and love, or does the soul and that love go on? My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Karen Frances McCarthy, was a skeptic until her beloved reached out to her from beyond the veil and changed her perspective and her life. Karen Frances McCarthy is a former major media journalist, twice published best-selling author, and a progressive spiritualist medium with a private practice in New York and a teaching practice at centers around the world. While serving as a political and war correspondent, she was on assignment when she received the news that her partner had suddenly died in New York. Skeptical by nature and numbed by the tragedy, she spiraled into a deep state of grief about never communicating with him again until he did. That resulted in a true, down-to-earth but transformational story of a journey to awakening to the nature of consciousness and the knowledge that love and life never die. Her website is KarenFrancesMedium.com, and she joins me this week to share her path and her compelling book, Till Death Don't Us Part, a true story of awakening to love after life. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Karen Frances McCarthy. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Victor. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us and telling your compelling story. It's really amazing. And listeners, get her book. This is really an amazing story. And it just came out as an Audible book. And it is now a hot seller. What is the phraseology for that, Karen?
It's the Amazon's #1 hot new release.
#1 hot new release. And it's just such a compelling and beautiful story. So please get it. Karen, I can speak from personal experience of a deep spiritual connection in childhood that I filed away with the responsibilities of adulthood and that reemerged and changed my life in my mid-30s. Please tell us about your early life growing up with the Celtic mysticism and spiritual traditions of your Ireland.
Well, I grew up, really largely in a Catholic family. At the time when I grew up, the nuns, the Catholic Church really took care of all of the education there. So Catholicism was very prominent. But sort of Celtic mysticism was just sort of there, just sort of seeped into the ethers. So I was always aware, for example, of like the fairy rings, where the fairies supposedly lived. And there was like a chocolate factory near my house, and they had built this factory on land where there was a fairy ring in the middle of it, but they actually built the factory around it. So these they've routed canals to avoid fairy rings, things like this, because you really don't want to mess with the fairies, as I'm sure you know. And so this was just part and parcel of what we knew growing up. I remember one night hearing what I thought was a banshee. Now, the fairies are actually the Sidhe. The Sidhe were these powerful supernatural beings that were said to occupy Ireland, prehistorically. And with the coming of Christianity, they were shrunk down into little fairies, by people who were trying to reconcile beliefs. But the Sidhe were very powerful beings. A lot of the folklore is about the Sidhe. And the banshee is a woman who combs her hair with a golden comb and cries. And you're supposed to never disturb her, or she would throw her comb and you would die, And I didn't find out until I was much, much older that the crying that I used to hear outside my window at night, thinking it was the banshee, I was afraid to look out, was actually cats, But you grow up with this and you believe it as a child,
And as a child, were you sensitive to subtle energy?
Yes, and, in just sort of very normal ways, and then sort of very, I will say paranormal. It's not a word I like because I kind of think paranormal is normal, but in what are traditionally normal ways. So I was just hypersensitive to other people, for one thing. My mother was always like, trying to get me out of my shell, but I was just a very, very sensitive child in general. I think most children who are sensitive to discarnate presence and to people in spirit form are naturally just hypersensitive themselves as well, just in this physical world. So certain like that as a child. And I do remember, waking up and seeing strange figures at the end of the bed, just sort of looking at me, and we wouldn't really say anything and I would just go back to sleep. I can honestly say it never bothered me. And my mother does remember me having conversations with grown-ups in thin air, so it's not like I was talking to imaginary children or, imaginary friends or little children or little creatures or animals. I was actually having, at 3 years old, conversations with adults in the hallway that nobody else could see.
I've shared that experience and I know exactly what you're talking about. So what changed your path and your beliefs?
Do I think you just sort of go along. I was, when I was kind of growing up, we were, dealing with just the politics. There was in Ireland, it was a very recessed economy. There was very little work. There were the troubles in Northern Ireland. People were doing terrible things to each other all of the time. And you just kind of grow up. And then, I was in school with the nuns, and by the time I got to 17 to get out of high school, or we call it secondary school, I thought, I've had it. I've had it with this. I've had it with the criticism and the discipline, and I want nothing to do with this at all anymore. And I just really turned away from religion in any form, mysticism in any form. Was more interested, as you do as a teen, in going out and going to parties and clubs and meeting boys and this sorts of thing, and just going that way. I started getting into journalism as well. I started getting very interested in politics. And so all of the experiences I had in childhood sort of slowly but surely faded, got squeezed out and forgot about, to be honest.
And you did take on another spiritual practice, though, not a religious practice, but a spiritual practice.
Many, many, many years later, when I was in my probably late 30s, I started practicing Zen. And I had kind of gone to Zen because I had gone through many years of being a skeptic and an atheist, which had suited me fine until I got to maybe, late 30s and suddenly was like, something is not right. Something is off, something's missing. And I didn't really know where to find whatever was missing. And I ended up, where I lived in Brooklyn, there was a Zen center nearby. And I went on State Street and I just went up there and I just started sitting with them. And sort of the peace I experienced there was so simple. And, there's like no bells and whistles with Zen. It's very, very, very simple. There's very little dogma. It's like very common sense. And it's just very much about being present. And it kind of helped me in that way. But it's, most certainly non-theistic. And that suited me as well at the time.
Absolutely. As a journalist, you were deeply involved in events in both Ireland and Iraq. Please share those with us.
Well, mostly what I had done was just before I wrote this, my first book was called The Other Irish. And that book was written, it ended up being part of or adopted by the Irish government. There was a combined body, British and Irish organisation that was designed to try to help bring peace in Northern Ireland. And part of one of the avenues they were exploring was cultural outreach. So I wrote this book called The Other Irish, which is actually about how the people from Northern Ireland settled in America and influenced American society. And so it was considered, me being a Catholic, culturally a Catholic, writing about the Protestants in Northern Ireland, it was considered sort of a cultural outreach that we were a sort of bridge. And I ended up doing an awful lot of talks and going to a lot of places, the Linen Hall, like these these very sort of Protestant strongholds in Northern Ireland where Catholics would never really go. But there was a really beautiful sort of opening there. You know, I was welcomed into these places. We had interesting conversations all across Northern Ireland when I was promoting the book and talking about the book. And so that was considered. I mean, it's kind of strange. You just do these little things, you know, and all of a sudden it ends up having this sort of significance that I'd never anticipated. And I ended up shortly before that, I had gone to Iraq for the Irish Times, and I had contributed to some other newspapers. And you just sort of are doing things, and all of a sudden you realize at the end that it all becomes more significant and more important than you thought. And I ended up being named as one of like the top Irish female broadcasters who'd made an international impact, really just by being politically aware, you know.
So at the time you had this beloved, his name was Johann. Tell us about Johann.
So Johann was German, and we had lived in Brooklyn together and had quite a tumultuous relationship. We've had a much easier relationship interdimensionally than we had on the planet. So he was a very interesting character. I do talk about him. There are quite a few scenes in the book of the book starts with his death. I had been away down south. I was actually researching something on the other Irish at the time. And I was down south when I got this phone call to say that he had died suddenly one Saturday afternoon in New York. He loved to cycle. He had gone out for a bike ride and just stopped and had a sudden massive heart attack. So it was only 41. So it was very... it was incomprehensible to me for the longest time, and I do write about just this fog that I was in after that happened. But, you know, he was a super intelligent person, very, very creative, very sarcastic, very funny, quite at times very difficult individual to deal with. But I do remember one time. And this is actually the scene is in the book. How he proposed is in the book. And I just remembered, and it's kind of this sort of funny scene, but I just remember at the time, it was just one of those odd, and this was before I'd had, as we were talking about this sort of reawakening or this awakening. We were just talking about it, and I just remember having these odd, very profound feeling, like an epiphany was the only way I could describe it, that we were always meant to be together for all our difficulties. And I actually think there was something about that relationship, that it wasn't just about his death, it was about our connection, I do believe, is what really set up and facilitated all of the events that followed. Because I do feel on some very, very deep, profound soul level, there was that sort of connection there, because I've never experienced an epiphany like the one I had when he proposed. It was like, how did this elude me? It was almost like I felt I had been born knowing that we were supposed to be together, forgot about it for years and years and years, and now I've just sort of, here it is back in my face. Oh yes, how did I forget this? Of course we were always meant to be together. And I think there was something about the connection that we had that made it possible for the events that followed to unfold.
And what was the first indication that his spirit was reaching out to you?
Well, there was a whole ton of indications that really most people were, saying, well, those are after-death communications. And I was saying, no, I think it's actually me having a psychotic breakdown, because there were just all of these signs people talk about. They started within like 3-4 days after he died, just feeling like people sitting on the bed, seeing things, feeling things, smelling things, all of this going on. Initially, I thought I had lost my mind from grief. And oddly enough, the local parish priest, I got lost one day. I was in this little town in Virginia. I stayed there. And I came across this tiny little Catholic church. And I got to speaking to the priest. And the priest, oddly enough, was the one. I went in and I started crying. I thought I'm having a nervous breakdown, and he was the one who assured me, no, these are signs that our loved ones give us to let us know that they are doing okay. And that kind of was the one thing that made me start to think about this. But in all honesty, Victor, it was not a single thing. It wasn't like, one friend of mine said, do you know something? You're not just getting signs, you're getting burning bushes. I think the easiest way for me to illustrate what had happened, what the sort of events that were happening after he passed away at that time, is for me to share a clip from the audio book of Till Death Don't Us Part. It's the true story of awakening to love after life. The audiobook just came out this week, and as Victor mentioned earlier, I've been so excited to see that it was the #1 hot new release on Amazon. But I'll be happy to share a clip from that to illustrate some of these stories.
Please do.
I clambered up from beneath the pine tree. I needed to move. I needed to stop thinking. Every tiny thing sparked a memory of him. I needed to eat something. My stomach was stripped. I shook out my hair to get rid of whatever was stuck there that I couldn't see and went into the kitchen to forage for snacks. There were slim pickings except for a few oranges in the fridge. I took a couple, shut the door, and swung around to come face to face with a large, two-dimensional, solid black figure standing in the doorway. I froze. It looked like a black hole I'd seen on TV with a perfectly crisp edge that delineated its dense, dark form from the event horizon surrounding it. But this wasn't a black hole. It was crudely outlined and had no neck so that the shoulders and head were fused like a gorilla. But it wasn't a gorilla. It was a tall, broad man, 6 foot easily, silent and unmoving. It wasn't just blocking the doorway. It had been lurking behind me while I rummaged in the fridge. It disappeared. Tap, tap, tap. Juice was dripping onto my feet and all over the floor. I'd gripped the oranges so hard I'd punctured the skin. My breath was shallow and my heart was racing. I scanned the kitchen for an explanation. Billions of times a day my brain created 3-dimensional constructs out of the 2-dimensional images impinging on my retina. Neurons in my visual cortex made the 3rd dimension appear, but not this time. The kitchen was bright, so it wasn't a trick of the light, and I couldn't blame it on peripheral vision where floaters or fleeting black flashes often appear in tired eyes. This, whatever it was solid, stationary, in full frontal vision, and by no means fleeting.
Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing that clip with us. That was wonderful. How did these communications continue?
Well, after a while, I was talking to a lot of people, so it was really a very, very, very hard turn for me to make. I mean, it's not easy to come out of being a diehard cynic, I will go as far as to say, to taking this on board. So I had, thankfully, an awful lot of help from people along the way. And as I started to become more open to the possibility that communication could continue, that consciousness in some form, although I didn't know exactly what form at the time, could continue, they stopped being as scary as that clip that you just heard. And they started to look more like I could see his personality in the signs. And that eventually led to the penny dropping.
Her book is called Till Death Don't Us Part, a true story of awakening to love after life. Karen McCarthy, please share with our listeners where they can get your book, your audiobook, and learn more about all the wonderful work that you do.
Well, the book is available from all major booksellers, so probably the best thing to do is, at this stage, just go to Amazon, or you can get the Kindle, you can get the Apple books there. I think nearly all major booksellers. I actually just found out Target is actually selling it as well now. And then the audiobook, which has just come out, is on Audible. I think it's going to be out on Apple soon, but I don't think it's not on Apple yet. But certainly Amazon and Audible at the moment is definitely there.
And your websites?
My website is karenfrancismedium.com, and that website has, a lot of the the writing that I do, a lot of the interviews that I do, I put a lot of little free meditations and stuff up there as well. And then also a lot of the courses that I teach are up there as well. So, I've actually been very, very, very fortunate to myself. I've received some very good training over the years that I've been able to redesign into these nice courses that I'm able to offer at different places around the world now. So there's information about those there at KarenFrancisMedium.com.
And we'll be back with more of Karen and Till Death Don't Us Part after these words on the OMTimes radio network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM-FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
Hey, Dad, your prescription will be ready in just a minute. Hey, Dad, your laundry will be ready in just a minute. Dad, your lunch will be ready in just a minute.
Hey, honey, why don't you take a minute? When you help care for a loved one, you give them as much time as you can, making sure they're safe and comfortable. But it's just as important that you take some time for yourself. At AARP, we can help with information and useful tips on how you can maintain a healthy life balance, care for your own physical and mental well-being, and manage the challenges of caring for a loved one. Because the better care you take of yourself, the better care you can provide for your loved one.
Thanks, Dad.
Thank you. You're there for them. We're here for you. Find free care guides to support you and your loved one at aarp.org/caregiving. That's aarp.org/caregiving. A public service announcement brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
You get that every time.
Reservations at your favorite restaurant.
I've been trying to reduce gluten. You don't want to know why.
Thanks so much for waiting. Your table's ready.
Getting back to the moments we miss starts with getting informed.
Perfect. Thanks.
Get the latest info about COVID-19 vaccines at getvaccineanswers.org. It's up to you. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Karen Francis McCarthy. We're talking about her book, Till Death Don't Us Part, a true story of awakening to love after life. So you had all these amazing and wonderful confirmations from Johann on the other side. How did this reawakening change you? How did it change your philosophy of life and afterlife?
Oh my goodness, it changes absolutely everything. And it changes things on levels you couldn't even anticipate. I couldn't have anticipated. So for one thing, you know, I'd had a very sort of secular, very materialistic view of life. Like, we're here, we live, we die, that's it, we're done. and that's the end. That's all she wrote there, and that obviously, as I said, it was a very, very hard corner to turn to accept the reality of what was going on. So that was one thing that, just in terms of my perspective on life. But the funny thing is that you would think that would mean you'd be more cavalier about life, because you think, oh well, it goes on. You know what I mean? But in actual fact, it had the opposite effect. I actually began to really value life more, which is kind of interesting, I think. And I find that with a lot of people I meet who are sort of awakened and are aware and conscious of the nature of consciousness, is that you begin to notice that life is richer and more precious, because I don't know if it's that we know, you have the time, or we know we're only limited. It takes away the fear of death, so it allows us to live with more presence. That was a huge thing. Taking away the fear of death, I really do believe helps us live life more fully now. So that was one huge shift. And then, and of course, on other levels, and I know this has happened to a lot of people, old friends who were with me, old skeptics who we were all skeptics together, in the club, they weren't able to accept this at all. And so I ended up losing, to be honest, quite a lot of friends. And then at the same token, making a whole bunch of other friends. And even some people who I knew, who I maybe hadn't been that close to, when they heard the story, turned out they were very open to it. So I had this whole shift in my circle of friends, and that you couldn't have anticipated. For the longest time, I was afraid to tell anybody this, what was going on, because I was sure they would think I was bananas. And when I did, they did. But it had to be that way. It had to fall away. I had to move forward, and I had to change the path. And then also the work changed. I lost interest in politics. I just started feeling like it's like Groundhog Day. There's something bigger and much more meaningful and mystical here in the world. And my interest shifted there, which is why I started then writing about spirituality. I worked on this book, and I started really doing a substantial amount of reading and research, some of which is in the book, Until Death Don't Us Part, to really try to understand how can this be, and so I've got to be very sort of science nerdy as well, strangely enough, about this too.
I've also found, especially in the last 10, 15 years, with quantum science, quantum mechanics, that science is giving definition to many of these things that we experience that before was considered, as you said, paranormal, but it's actually very normal and part of nature, and we're going to discover more of that as the years ensue.
Yes, I know. How exciting is that? I'm really looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Also, talking about when you had a change in life, I find that many of my current friends and the people I've been with over these past 30 or 40 years, that when they hit their 30s, they had a dramatic change in life, and in the recognition that they had to pursue something different, go on a different path, perhaps one that was contrary to their peers and their friends, that they experienced too the loss of friendship and the loss of those people, but gained new family, almost spiritual family in the process.
Yeah, it's like you have to curate a new family and a new circle to suit, because your path changes. Like my path changed so much that the old patterns and the old sort of comfort levels just didn't apply anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Your reawakened path included training in developing your gifts and also healing. How did you pursue this?
Well, I came across spiritualism, which I really did value a lot. And I did a lot of training at the Arthur Findlay College in just outside London there, which I talk about as well in the book. I really felt, to be honest, that I didn't want, people were sort of popping in, and there are some scenes that are very interesting, whereas I would just sort of sit down with somebody and a relative would pop in and I would give them some, that doesn't really happen anymore, but unless, people don't just pop in like that. But I really felt a great need to be very responsible. Unfortunately, I ended up being at the sort of receiving end of a lot of mediums who were very superstitious and very negative. And it really taught me a very, very valuable lesson that it is crucially important to be well read, to be well informed, to be well trained. Because if you're going to do this work, everybody sitting in front of you, by definition, is suffering. Because they're generally people who come to a medium are grieving, or they need help, and so people are sitting in front of you are very, very vulnerable. And so I also not only did substantial amount of training in mediumship and psychic development and healing with the SNU and the Arthur Findlay College, I also did a diploma in grief and bereavement counselling with the Institute of Counselling in Scotland, because I really just I really didn't want anybody to suffer at the hands of uninformed people the way I had done, on my path. And so I just felt it was, when I head over there, I'm going to have to answer for myself, and I want to make sure that I have done this well. And I also feel I owe it to Johan to do it well, because I wouldn't be doing it without him, So I feel like this needs to be done responsibly, compassionately, and in an informed way, so that the work is contributing to the highest good and well-being of other people.
From my practice and work, I know that grieving is a very individual process. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people, in thinking that they're helping their friends and family who have had a loss, will start using expressions and words that really don't comfort them.
Not at all, my goodness. They can, the amount of times people kept telling me that, I'd meet somebody else. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, it's only gone 3 months and we're still negotiating this new relationship in this new form. And we're still learning this language so we can communicate with each other. And every time I talk to somebody, they're telling me, you'll meet somebody else. And I'm like, how is that helpful? Or people are always sort of, you have to move on. I'm like, I think it's like a very misunderstood situation. Like, nobody moves on from grief. You learn to absorb it, you learn to incorporate it into your life, and then you learn to live with it. I mean, obviously it's not always as raw, but you don't move on and sort of leave it behind down the street somewhere,
Absolutely. And I also have learned in my work that no two people grieve the same way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Some get deeply involved in busyness and doing work to take their mind off their grief. Some people laugh hysterically. Some people cry, go into depression. But there's no right way or wrong way to grieve. Absolutely. It's each to their own in their own time, and this idea of, you get a year, says who, but there's all sorts of misconceptions, and people are very keen to offer unsolicited advice. And I think part of it is they just don't know what to do, and they don't realize that all they need to do is give the grieving person the gift of their presence. Presence and sacred listening without interjection. Absolutely, yeah. In your practice and studies, the gifts that we're talking about, spiritualistic gifts, healing gifts, are these perhaps dormant but available to everyone? Yeah, I think so. I don't actually call them gifts at all. They're these things I do. It's, I think everybody has an ability. I prefer the word ability, to be honest, Victor, has an ability to be aware of the unseen world, or to be aware of the unseen forms. Part of it just comes from, do you have any interest in even bringing your awareness to there? I always liken this to sort of music. It's like I have no musical ability at all. If I spent months sitting in front of a piano, probably the best a teacher could teach me would be to play chopsticks, But some people sit down and they're just beautiful and fabulous piano players. So I think the reason why I prefer to call it an ability is because it's akin to anything we do in life. Some people do it really, really well, and some people not so well. Some people do something else better, And so I do think everybody, to some degree, has an ability
to be a healer, and when I say medium, at least to be aware of the presence of loved ones, at least to be aware of discarnate consciousness. I do feel that intuition is something that everybody has that is often overlooked because we keep going to intellects and analysis, like life is a problem to be solved instead of something to be experienced. And so we sort of, shunt intuitive wisdom and intuitive guidance off to the back of the queue. But that really is the voice of the spirit. So it's present in everybody to one degree or another.
I shared in our introduction about being open as children and then closing down. I was discouraged as a child when discussing my experiences and had been labeled with an overactive imagination until I shared something with my parents that actually manifested. What advice would you offer parents of children who are showing these abilities?
Yeah, that's really good. I have a friend with 2 children and they are both ghost mad. And one of them, like me, sees spirits standing at the end of the bed. But he's always, even since he was he's actually in my book, Sean, he's in the book. Since he was very small, he has been aware of the presence of other forms, other discarnate people. Fortunately for him, his mother listens to me all the time. So she's just sort of, if he wants to talk about it, she'll talk to him about it, I think it's important. What's important is that parents acknowledge the reality of what's happening so that they can reassure the children that it's perfectly all right. See, I think when parents discount it or try to excuse it or try to label it as something else, the children know that that's not the case. The children know what's going on. And then what happens is that they will retreat into themselves and it becomes a secret and it becomes something they can become afraid of. So I think it's important, like my friend does this, is to actually just talk to them like it's a completely normal thing, which it is. And also to assure them that it's nothing to be afraid of. You see, because a lot of the time, the people they are seeing standing at the end of the bed are people who love them. It could be grandparents, it could be somebody else who are just popping in just to keep an eye on them, to say hello, to say they love them. And the little children wouldn't necessarily recognize them and they can find it frightening. So I think it's important for parents to reassure their children that this is probably just their granny or great granny and not to be worried, to just see if they're okay and reassure them that there's nothing at all to be afraid of,
Absolutely. Tell us about some of the classes that you teach.
Well, I teach, obviously I teach some mediumship, and I'm actually really excited. There's a couple of new courses coming up. I'm teaching one at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, which I'm really looking forward to, which is Mindfulness to Mysticism. And what I'm really excited about in the stuff that I'm starting to teach now is that it's kind of moving more into having broader appeal. So I'm a firm believer that mysticism, psychic awareness and intuition begins with mindfulness. And mindfulness is so well accepted now at this point that we're going to be starting to work on how to move from mindfulness and to start using the tools and the access the wisdom of the spirit to bring forth these sort of mystical experiences. So that's at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's a new course I just designed. And another one I'm doing is with, I think, people which is the One Spirit Learning Alliance.
Yes.
And next year I'm going to be teaching a 4-week course in sacred states and achieving and reaching and experiencing sacred states. So I'll be doing that with them. So I'm very excited about those two. And I do teach, mediumship and psychic development and animal communication, which I love. And I teach a lot of trance. So trance healing, trance speaking, trance writing. And I do teach inspirational writing, love to teach writing. So we do a lot of very experimental, creative work in these, trance writing groups as well. One of my favourites.
And offline, you said you have an event coming up in July.
Yes, it was just really interesting how this came about. The One Spirit Learning Alliance, once a month they have a gathering, what they call a gathering. Somebody comes in and talks, gives a sort of a talk for about an hour. And as I was talking to them, what became very apparent in conversation was that people have been really struggling, as we all know, for the last year, but particularly people who have loved ones who died in the last year because they weren't allowed to be with them at their bedside. And so I've experienced this a lot in the mediumship work I've been doing. I've had, I think, 7 people who died of COVID come to communicate with a loved one who's come to me. And that message is always, it's okay, because the loved one left behind, people are just so worried and feel so guilty, and they haven't had those beautiful experiences that I know you and I have had of being able to sit with a loved one as they transition. It can be very anxiety provoking not to be there. And so what I'm giving is a talk which came up for this specifically at this time, called No One Dies Alone. And it's basically me talking about my experiences with mediumship, with those communications, but also my experiences of sitting with people in the process of transitioning and being aware of who's around them and being able to name complete strangers so that you know without a doubt, oh my goodness, that person has to be here, because how would she know who they were? And, and it creates what I've noticed when I tell these stories. It's been very, very reassuring to people to realize that, Auntie Betty was at the bed or Nana was at the bed and that my loved one was aware of them. I watched my mother look at people in empty spaces, when she was transitioning. It's very comforting for people still here to know that the people on that side were there and present for their loved one. So their loved one didn't die alone. So we're going to be giving that talk. And I'll be taking questions actually on that as well. And that's, I think, the 1st of July at One Spirit Learning Alliance gathering.
And where could they find information about that?
I don't know that I will have it on my website soon, and I know the One Spirit, I think it's onespirit.org, the number onespirit.org. It will be there shortly as well. And then it'll be listed on my website, KarenFrancisMedium.com soon as well, as soon as we have the link for it.
Her book is Till Death Don't Us Part, a true story of awakening to love after life. We'll be back with more of Karen after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free, ascendinghearts.com.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Hi, this is Bill Maher. I can find humor in almost anything, but one thing I never laugh about is cruelty to animals. If you don't get the joke either, write People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, 501 Front Street, Norfolk, Virginia, 23510.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Karen Francis McCarthy. We're talking about her book, Till Death Don't Us Part, a true story of awakening to love after life. How may those pursuing their gifts, or their abilities as you call them, differentiate between spirit, wishful imagination and perhaps ego. I'll give you a quick example. A few years back, I was driving on a local highway at highway speed, about 55 miles an hour. There was a lot of traffic, but everything was moving. And I heard a voice tell me, get out of this lane now. I was in the left lane. I moved immediately to the center lane. And within about 5 seconds, there was a multiple car accident in the lane that I was in. And had I not listened to the voice, I would have been in the middle of that accident. So how do people differentiate between something that's perhaps wishful imagination or ego and actual spiritual guidance?
Well, I think one thing is going to be the nature of it. So if it's something that is positive, it's generally going to be, as you call it, the spirit speaking. People who have negative, because we can get sort of into situations of like schizophrenia, for example. I had a friend who was a fantastic medium, but her sister was schizophrenic. And it was really easy to tell the difference because the words and the messages that were coming to the elder sister were very sort of uplifting and caring and, like you say, there to sort of help along. But the messages that the sister who had schizophrenia was picking up were very sort of strange and negative, like mother's here and she's telling me I have to take a bath every day or twice a day. Do you know, just these weird things. And she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. But strangely enough, the other sister was medium and they hadn't diagnosed her with schizophrenia. So I think in that case, it was probably accurate. There are things also in terms of the clarity of the message. So I noticed that if we pay attention to how our minds work and how our thought processes work, we don't actually think, as we're just sort of ruminating our way through the day, we don't really think in full sentences. It's not like we wake up in the morning and I go, okay, Karen, it's 8 o'clock, get up and make a cup of tea. You just sort of do. There's just sort of this half thought that motivates you just to get up and make a cup of tea. That's how we sort of think. It's almost like a dreamscape, What I have noticed is that, and my mother does this in particular, is that if all of a sudden you have a thought that comes in like a very clean sentence, that didn't come from your mind, because that's not how our minds generate thoughts, So, to give a very quick example, my father just passed away, and we had to sell our childhood home. And my mother had passed away 5 years before my father, and it was a very, very, very difficult thing to do. My mother loved her house; she has a beautiful garden, and I ended up selling it to a young couple who were just starting out in life, who didn't have 2 pennies almost. Everything they had was going into the house. And I ended up selling it to them for a bit less than the next offer, because there was just something about them that I thought, I feel like they'll really value my mother's home. And so I came back to New York, and I had everything packed up, moved out, got on a plane, came back to New York. And I was sitting there just thinking to myself, I wonder what my mother thinks, sort of these sort of half thoughts that we have. I wonder what she thinks of that. And I went to say to my mother, Mom, how do you feel? And, my intention, of course, was to say, how do you feel about this couple in your house? But I only got as far as, how do you feel? And she interrupted, as clear as day, it's only my mother does this, said, couldn't be happier. Mm-hmm. But because that was a crisp, clear sentence and it interrupted my thought, it couldn't have come from my mind, because that's not how our minds process information. So that's a real giveaway. I think if you have, like you were saying, driving along, if you've got a suddenly very strong, inexplicable feeling that is not motivated by some sort of thinking, like if you're walking along a dark alleyway at night and you start thinking about Stephen King or all sorts of scary things, and you suddenly get afraid, you have brought that fear in yourself through your thought processes. But if you're just sort of walking along, minding your own business, and suddenly you're hit with this overwhelming feeling of fear, then you know that you have not generated that from your mind.
Absolutely. That's very valuable advice. Thank you for sharing that. We hear the expression, the veil is thin, often around Halloween, which is also known as Samhain. Is the veil thinner now than it's been before?
Do you know, I really think it's a really good question. I think for some people it is thinner, and for some people it's the same as it ever was. And I really do feel it depends on where you are on your path, what you're interested in, how you feel about your place in life. Because I do feel as soon as people start questioning their purpose and meaning, and things like that, they start to turn their attention and their awareness to these higher forms of life, these higher forms of living, which I believe is the Spirit speaking. And once that happens, it feels to me like the veil becomes thin. But I feel like the motivation for that, I know there's lots of people disagree with me on this, but I do feel the motivation for that comes from the person's own spirit itself awakening and having voice and being listened to.
Are more people than ever awakening to their spiritual abilities?
Well, that's a very difficult to quantify because, you know, I kind of roam since, as we said earlier, you know, a lot of the old friends fell away and I had to kind of find new ones. The circle of people that I know now are all very much aware of the sorts of things I'm aware of. But I still do have family and still have friends who were never open to that and still aren't. So again, I really do think that it really, again, feels like the voice of the soul speaking in some people to search for something more. And that, because, you know, what we kind of, to some degrees, we know, and I don't want to get too sort of pedantic or, you know, pseudo-scientific about this, but we do, to a large extent, our perception creates our reality, or certainly influences our reality. And if we start to perceive that there must be something more, I do feel that we tend to find it.
You're in the process of earning your doctorate with a fascinating thesis. What will your dissertation be about?
Yes, I'm doing a PhD on the cultural influences on contemporary ghost literature. When I say contemporary ghost literature, it's like in the last 20 years. And what I've discovered is that there's a trend in ghost literature now. It used to be that it was either influenced by Christian thought or medieval thought or Victorian thought largely, whereby, you know, the ghost was like the antagonist. It was like the 2D character. It was just back to haunt, like Hamlet's father or whatever, or Scrooge, you know, and all of the action happened here on the planet. And the ghost was sort of this two-dimensional character who served a function really in the life of the hero of the piece. And, or it was, are they real or are they not real? Or it's, you know, it's sort of scary horror stories or whatnot. What I've discovered is, and this is quite interesting to me when we're talking about thinning of the veil, I actually myself wonder if this is a sort of a manifestation of that, is that what I've noticed is there's a sort of a trend now of moving the action into the afterlife, the so-called afterlife, into that realm, that dimension, whatever you want to call it. And now the heroes are the supposed ghosts. You know, so if you look at Lincoln in the Bardo, or if you look at Five People You Meet in Heaven, or if you look at A Brief History of the Dead, they're playing out all of these normal things in the afterlife, you know, and the questions of is it real or is it not real have become irrelevant. And people are just sort of growing and healing and in all of these different sorts of ways and different sorts of styles in this contemporary fiction. And so I was really interested to know what has causing that shift. It's only, with the exception of Matheson's book, What Dreams May Come, maybe a couple of other, but particularly that book, which came out in the 70s. The rest of them have continued to be hauntings, more or less, until now, until very recently. And so I'm looking at the cultural influence on that. What could be causing that trend? You know, because all literature is a product of the society it emerges from. And so what is going on in our society that, you know, these are like Pulitzer Prize winners, Man Booker Prize winners, I mean, New York Times bestsellers, you know, these are not obscure little fringe books, are starting to think about and present these stories in ways that they haven't done before. So I'm kind of looking at the hard problem of consciousness and consciousness theory and the, you know, morphic resonance and you know, quantum non-locality and entanglement and these sorts of ideas that are kind of seeping into our society. And my argument, what I'm going to argue, is that that's sort of seeping into our psyche on some level, and it has caused this shift in how we start to perceive our stories.
The crossroads of science and spirituality, which is the theme of this program. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm so excited to get into it. I'm really enjoying it, I have to say. So, and it's so bizarre because one minute I'm reading, the books by Dutch cardiologists, and the next minute I'm reading Dante. So it's terrific.
That's wonderful. Do you think the near-death experience books that have come out over the last 10 or 15 years are affecting this also?
Oh, yes, hugely. I think, these shifts started really back in the 70s with Raymond Moody, with the research into near-death experiences, even with Ian Stevenson on reincarnation. I think once the scientists sort of got into it to start going, hang on a second, something's going on here, then people start thinking about it as something other than superstition. I also think that another influence on this is in the 60s and 70s, sort of arrival of Eastern concepts into our Western way of thinking, which has really sort of, put something new and different into the melting pot for us all to think about as well. So, yeah, absolutely. And, and again, the near-death experience is facilitated by advances in medicine, advances in science. And we have these stories now because of that. So these stories could only really happen now because 50 years, 60, 70 years ago, it wouldn't really have been as possible because we didn't really have ways to measure these things. You didn't have the technology for this.
Her book is called Till Death Don't Us Part, a true story of awakening to love after life. Karen McCarthy, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you.
Well, my book you can get online really anywhere. Amazon's probably the easiest place. You can get the paperback Kindle or my new audio book, which I just recorded and just came out this week, there as well. And if anyone's interested in any of the work I'm doing, I do courses, I do free events, I do quite a lot of talks and lectures as well. Please do visit my website. There's some free stuff there as well. If you want to sit and experiment with different altered states, feel free to go to my website and listen to some of the guided meditations there. And it's KarenFrancisMedium.com.
Karen, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your amazing and wonderful story.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Victor. It's been lovely to be here.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.